With the epidemic of crafting in video games in the past decade, it's rather surprising to see how little crafting has progressed in TTRPGs. It's definitely needed, with how they emphasize creative expression and certain aspects of realism in their design philosophy. However, most attempts at a crafting system in an RPG results in a few dice rolls, a material cost, some downtime spent doing it, and the product of all of that is a meaningless name in a person's inventory from then on, to be used or sold later. To be quite blunt, crafting in TTRPGs is boring to do. I know why these systems exist in the first place. Players love to make things, and making a game in which they can be anything they like includes a person who can create beautiful sculptures and amazing weaponry. However, it's difficult in a non-visual medium to effectively reward a player for the creation of an item, as it can be hard to accurately illustrate worth through word alone. Describing a sword that a character makes requires a lot of effort on the game master's and player's part in terms of flavor and description. While this works well from a storytelling standpoint, it does not cover the fact that the core of the system is unsatisfying itself. The roles and the mechanics involved should be fun, and the payoff should be cathartic in that it gives players a sense of accomplishment they would otherwise not have. To really understand how to create that sense of catharsis, we have to look at what goes into crafting and making things in real life. I've always loved to make things. When I was a kid, I was hammering little pieces of scrap wood together to make anything from a tiny table to a Beyblade arena. I folded paper into cranes and jumping frogs. I'm sure that everyone watching and listening have made things, whether it be from drawing to writing, carpentry to cooking. Whether it's putting things together physically or making marks on paper have meaning, people are driven by creative desires to express themselves. And when you're done and finished with what you set out to make, do you ever sit back and admire your own work? There's something so satisfying with seeing a completed piece, seeing how the individual pieces formed a final product, the entire creative process and the work involved, all in one single thing at the end of the day. That work and drive to make something, even when you might initially blunder or have difficulty with it, is what makes looking at the final product so satisfying. Let's compare that experience to a few well-known RPGs that exist out there. In D&D 5th edition, the process that goes into making something is completely bare bones, if it even exists at all. If a player character is a certain level and can cast spells, or not according to Xanathar's guide, they can make a magic item by spending 8-hour days on it, which contributes 25 gold to the item's price. When they reach an equal amount to the item, the crafting is complete and they have made it. This has some very obvious issues to it. Firstly, there is no process here. It is just a downtime system designed around allowing players to make whatever they like and time skip, with no investment in the activity from anyone involved. Secondly, this is altogether too slow of a method. Making a rare magical item takes more than half a year in-game, and let's not even get into the higher numbers. It essentially works as a way for players to get items without really paying for them, except through in-game time. This is really just a substitute for the gold cost, as the characters could be doing other tasks to earn the required money to buy the item in the first place. It's the bare minimum of a system, and even a spin-off of D&D is done better. Let's talk about that spin-off, Pathfinder 2nd Edition. Crafting in here is a bit better than vanilla D&D, but not by much. Players pay half the material cost of an item up front, then work for 4 in-game days and make a roll. If the roll meets a number as set by the game master, the player successfully makes half of an item. They don't make the full item. No, that'd be too much to ask for working on a dagger for 4 days straight. Instead, they simply make good progress with the amount of money they put in. After these 4 days, the player can either put the rest of their money into the cost of the item or continue working on it each day, making crafting checks to see how much gold they reduce the cost by. Now, if you didn't catch that, I'll simplify some of the process for you. A level 1 player wants to make an acid flask, so they pay half the price and work for 4 days. After the 4 days are up, they make a craft check, and if that's successful, they don't waste the money they put in. Once a player gets to this point, they could just put the rest of the money in and get the item they want immediately. But how is this any different from just buying the item, you ask? It's not. It's buying the item with a dice roll attached to it. Now, if the player chooses to go the other route and spend more days to craft items, they could be looking at an extra in-game week of downtime to make something as simple as a low-level acid flask that does only 1d6 damage. So, one method of crafting is just shopping with extra steps, and the other method takes entirely too long to get anything meaningful done. Not a very good system. but I guess it's better than 5e's. Let's take a peek at a system that isn't a combat-based game. Vampire the Masquerade. In it, the role used to craft is called creation. It can use a variety of skills and attributes, all of which are up to the game master, and allows for a much more freeform system to make the kind of objects you want. It certainly catches the feeling of the different kinds of work that goes into creating something, but the catch here is that it doesn't quantify it. The lack of rules offsets the work done to the game master, and mostly it is just the different kinds of roles one could make. While this could be useful for artistic expression and writing poems or painting in the game, it does not help with really visualizing the difficulty of creation and the satisfaction of a job well done. It is definitely the most appealing out of the systems I've mentioned, though, and I wouldn't put it down as bad. Rather, it takes a few steps in the right direction. The rules prompt us to make rules for gaining the subject matter of an art piece, and that different kinds of art and products require different amounts of work. This is mainly because Vampire the Masquerade prioritizes roleplay and storytelling as an RPG, as opposed to the combat-based systems of D&D and Pathfinder. It gives variety to the system and makes creation feel dynamic, as a crafting system should. It just seems a bit too abstract to be particularly great. So what would result in a great crafting system? What elements do we need to take into account when designing these games? Well, the easiest and first thing to do is look at what not to do. So, we definitely don't want a system that is just buying with extra steps or ticking off marks until you're done. We also don't want it to be too vague in the rules, although we should allow for creativity to shine through. Allowing that variety to crafting and gamifying the different stages of creation would definitely help to make an overall fun system to play. A system that allows game masters and players to recognize the differing amounts of work that goes into making things and provides an actual framework for the game master to base the difficulty off of would also be helpful. It should have a built-in collection system for the players, so they can find items that they can later use to craft with, or even look for these items themselves. This allows for players to put a bit more work into their crafting, and while it does encourage them to be in their character sheets more, it allows for some resourcefulness to shine through when they are considering what to make and how to go about it. Making the crafting system centered around a few key materials that are split up in different ways depending on what you make them with would definitely lead to more satisfaction, as players will look for the optimal ways in which to craft the item they want to make. Allowing for more design to the actual item beyond what it is would give players control over the creative process and allow them to make items that reflect in-game what they are in flavor. Putting in a bit of extra work in a system to allow players to choose how the weapon or armor or tool functions and its unique strengths will help in turn to make the weapon itself seem unique. This patches up a bit of the issue with trying to demonstrate worth in a non-visual medium. Tying numbers to the process can help game masters and players to better visualize the item. But this approach only really covers the creative process of making physical objects, though, such as a sword or a suit of armor. We'd need something much more narratively based for a piece of art. It would work to employ something similar to Vampire, where players search for inspiration, or how well they draw from their inspiration. An emphasis should also be made for the tools they have and where they're working on their art. There's a huge difference when trying to make art without a reference, or only having the ground as a hard surface when drawing. Such factors should be taken in, not just to create a more immersive experience, but also to help craft a story around a character's art. Maybe they choose to travel to a nearby cliffside overlooking the sea so they can use the vantage point as a reference for their painting. Maybe the characters want a certain setting that you won't encounter while just traveling. These small parts of art are essential, even though they can be taken for granted in real life. It would restore narrative purpose to the things the player makes, instead of another nameless painting or item they banged out while traveling between quests. And that's really the point of this whole thing. I find that making things in RPGs doesn't even come close to the same feeling as doing it in real life. The way the rules handwave through so much of the process of making something doesn't seem to capture that same joy of creation as it does when I actually sit down and draw or write. When you make something, you remember it. It's a piece of a person that's been worked on for hours, days, maybe longer. The artwork I've made throughout my life and the things I've written has stuck with me, even since I was a kid. There is rarely such a thing as a craft project that is forgotten once it's completed. But that's what quite a few large TTRPGs have been doing, enabling players to turn into factories instead of artisans.